Good afternoon, and welcome to today's edition of The Law and You. I'm your host, Shellon Washington. Today, we will be discussing the murder of Tyler Lewis, college student Tyler Lewis. And joining us today will be his mother and attorney at law, James Williamson. We will be discussing a few aspects of this case. I did mention this case before on my show, and I wanted to highlight a few things to the public as to new developments in this case. Some of the evidence in this case has been released from the Erie County DA's office, and some of the investigative work that was done by the campus police officers. And this information has now been made public. So the public can now be privy to this information via the FOIA Act. You can request it, and the information will be provided. Now, today we're going to be discussing a few aspects of the civil case. As I said before, I am the attorney representing the family on the civil aspect of this case. And I have James Williamson, who represented the family previously on the criminal aspect of this case, trying to get somebody prosecuted and to be held responsible for the murder of Tyler Lewis. I want you to welcome this afternoon the attorney James Williamson, and also the mother of the victim, Roquishia Lewis, is joining us. Hi, good afternoon. James, first to you. Good afternoon to you. We cannot hear you, Mr. Williamson. Good afternoon to you, Miss Lewis. How are you, Mrs. Lewis?
Oh, good afternoon. Okay. Thank you for having me.
And once
You're
again,
welcome.
good afternoon, Miss Lewis and Miss Washington. Good afternoon.
All right, so Mrs. Lewis, before we get into the discussion, the legalities of this case this afternoon, I want you to tell the public a little bit about your son, who's now deceased. His life was cut short because of negligence involved in this case. So I want you to tell the public a little bit about who your son was. I want people to know who Tyler Lewis was, and that he had a family, he had mother, father, his grandmother. Tell the public about your son.
Tyler was our pride and joy. He was 19 years old, a sophomore at Buffalo State University. He was a great kid. He was, I believe, every parent's dream. You know, he was loving, compassionate, outgoing. He loved sports, just well-rounded, all-American kid. You know, he was born, raised, and unfortunately buried in Long Island, New York. Tyler was my only child, the only grandson, only nephew. So, when the holidays came, it was all about Tyler. Everything, birthdays, we all love Tyler so much, and we miss him. Just left a gaping hole, in our hearts and our spirits.
Right. I want to share something because as you know, and as the public know, if they'd seen the press conference with the Erie County DA's office, they would have noticed the DA made certain statements regarding the circumstances surrounding the death of Tyler Lewis. So I want to ask you, as far as you know, because they didn't mention an altercation and drugs was mentioned. So I want you to tell the public, as far as you know, your son, was he involved in any illicit activities that you can recall? Did he had problems with the law before? Or was this a case where this was a surprise, what the DA was claiming to your family?
Absolutely. No, Tyler was upstanding, law-abiding citizen. He never got arrested, never got in any kind of trouble. It was total shock. Tyler, like I said, he was sheltered, so never got in a fight a day in his life. His friends would attest to that. He was just a loving, all-around great Christian kid.
Thank you, Mrs. Lewis. Mr. Williamson, I know that you were involved in this case from the inception. You were working with the Erie, well, not working with them, but you were trying to push to assist this family on getting some sort of prosecution in this matter. The family wanted, ideally, the killer or the person who's responsible for the death of their son to come forward and take responsibility. Could you tell the public just a little bit about your investigative work and where did you end up and what ultimately happened with the criminal aspect of this case?
Yes, definitely. Well, first off, I just want to give a lot of credit to Mrs. Lewis, Tyler's mother, who you just heard from. A lot of my investigatory work consisted of working closely with Mrs. Lewis, and just pretty much it was an exercise in listening to Mrs. Lewis. She knew who her son was. I mean, you opened up with a good question um, pertaining to what she knew about her son's activities. And she, of course, would be the best person to say, hey, look, what was said in the press conference by the DA or, whoever else that was involved. She knows her son well enough to know that something was amiss. So we were able to build off of that. I was working with another investigator who was very sympathetic towards the family. And because of that, he was willing to work with us. So he was able to tell us, if certain allegations. So, one of the allegations were that, um, Tyler might have been involved in some illicit activities. We were able to look at all the evidence, look at the facts, and between working with that investigator and Miss Lewis, knowing when things were amiss, knowing when things weren't true, we were able to use that to build off of it, to try to find information that would have been useful, to get the DA's office in Erie County to bring charges with a grand jury. So listening was a big part of this, Ms. Washington.
Right. Mrs. Lewis, just let me ask you another question and then we're going to let you go. And then Mr. Williamson and I will continue this discussion regarding some of the aspects of this case. Now, I know that this was a tremendous loss to you and your family. And actually, you're still grieving from the loss of your only child, because I know you've been taking steps to try to bring awareness to the public. You want the public to know. Now, what else are you trying to, or what would you like to say to the public regarding this case? What do you want the public to know about your family, about what you've been doing to bring some sort of justice and healing to your family after this mess? What do you want the public to know?
Well, it's I can't describe how what the impact of loss of Tyler, has done to our entire family. Um, we're trying to we will keep Tyler's memory alive and his legacy. Tyler wanted to become a real estate entrepreneur, so we plan on doing a foundation for Tyler and to keep his legacy alive. We also we have a Instagram page. We have all social media, Justice for Tyler Lewis, and we have a lot of stories on there, videos of how Tyler was and how he interacted with everyone. And this is just a great loss, and I just hope that someday we can get justice for Tyler.
I certainly do hope so too, Miss Lewis, Mrs. Lewis. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time off to come on this show. But I don't want to hold you for the entire duration of the show. So I'm going to let you go, and Mr. Williamson and I will continue the discussion. We're going to be talking about the civil aspect also of this case. But thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time out to be here this afternoon, Mrs. Lewis. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
God bless.
Thank you, Mrs. Lewis.
So, Mr. Williamson, back to you now. I want us to discuss further. I know you've taken some steps to get information or evidence released in this Tyler Lewis case. Do you mind telling the public if anything that you've gotten released from the DA's office or from the police department regarding this case?
Yes, definitely. We were able to, through FOIL requests, Freedom of Information Act, get investigatory information. And the investigation was taken care of by the police department at the university. It took a while, but on a rolling basis. They've been sending us about every month and a half evidence in the case. These pieces of evidence consist of picture evidence from the night of, maybe hours after the accident. They were classified during the grand jury, and they've been classified probably up until about, I like to say about 7 months ago is when we started retrieving evidence. So once again, when we got that evidence, I was able to look through the evidence and talk about, certain findings. I can't talk about them all now, but we were able to talk about the findings with Mrs. Lewis after carefully reviewing everything that took place. And you mentioned the statements that were made by the DA after the close of the grand jury. Some of the statements, we needed to reconcile some of the claims that were made. One of the claims you talked about was the activities that Tyler was involved in, of course, because if the public doesn't know, justification was a big issue in this case. So that's the specific aspect that we were trying to zero in on to find out, whether or not there actually was justification in our opinion. Because for those who don't know, a grand jury is a secret process. It's
Right.
held private, right?
Right. I think one of the things the public need to know is that nobody was actually prosecuted in this case. And this is one of the reasons why the family has continuously been pushing to bring public awareness, because they're still hoping somehow that somebody will eventually be prosecuted, because we believe that there might have been some sort of cover up. So the public need to be aware. Based on what we were told and what we even saw in press conferences, I personally don't believe it matches the evidence. I've even looked at the autopsy report, and from reviewing the autopsy report, it's inconsistent to what we're told. We're being told that the deceased was involved in an altercation. But when you look at the report, there's just one area of the deceased body that shows evidence of force being used, and that's the area where he was stabbed straight to the heart. And it appears that the person was on the left side of the deceased, because the stab wound, it was angled from right to left, indicating that the knife that was used to stab him, the person thrust it into the chest and pulled it towards the left side. And not only that, any form of contusion is only evident in the area where the stab was done. You examine the body, the medical examiner, he did his examination and he put it into the report. And there's no sign of any contusions, any other part of the body. It would have been described as hyperpigmentation, which is the language that the medical examiner used in the autopsy report. Hyperpigmentation. For those of you watching and don't know, I'm not an expert in terms of medicine, because I'm an attorney. But based on a report, I can read the report, and there's certain information that I personally can deduce. Any person can deduce certain information. A contusion speaks to an area where force was used. There was an impact, and there was some sort of rupture of blood vessels under the skin, and that's what gives the appearance of a contusion. Or in case of somebody who's darker in tone like you and I, it's going to show hyperpigmentation, meaning the area is going to appear darker than the other parts of the body. And there's absolutely no evidence on any other part of the body, based on what we saw on the autopsy report, that tells us that this boy was engaged in some sort of altercation. But when the DA went on television and he related the story to the public, he, beyond doubt, said to the public that the deceased was engaged in some sort of altercation. Now, my idea of an altercation, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Williamson, because you are a criminal attorney. My idea of an altercation, there have to be like some sort of fight or some sort of active interaction between people, right? But I don't see that from when you take a look at the autopsy report, I do not see that being evident. Even when I've looked through some of the evidence you yourself have seen and sent to me from the FOIA request, all I see is statements, and most of the statements I've seen from witnesses, the description that they give of the boys or the people who are engaged in the altercation, does not suit the description of Tyler Lewis. Mr. Williamson, do you mind telling us the description of your client? What did your client look like? Do you remember the description of Tyler Lewis?
Yes, no, definitely. Tyler Lewis, once again, he was a young man at the time, smaller in frame. He wasn't a heavy kid at all, wasn't that tall. Another physical attribute that he had that was important to remember is that at the time he was murdered, he was suffering from a broken femur from an injury that he had from months earlier. So, in addition to his diminished size, once again, was not a big man or big young man at all. He was also of diminished physical capacity because of that broken femur that he had sustained months earlier.
Right.
So,
And I mean, that description that you give, him being small in stature, the description give him as a little bit over 5 feet tall, 144 pounds.
about
And with that type of description, and based on what witnesses said who were actually on the scene or witnessed what was happening, that description wasn't provided as one of the persons who were actually at the car engaging in any type of altercation.
oh,
This
definitely.
deceased description did not suit any of those that the eyewitnesses said. And I think that is important. Wouldn't that be important when you're framing a criminal investigation, Mr. Williams? Wouldn't you think that would be?
Oh no, I think it's 100% important. It's physical attributes are definitely important when you're talking about an altercation. It lets you know what the person would have been capable of, what they wouldn't have been capable of. Every detail in a criminal investigation is important.
Right.
And
But somehow in this case, I guess I don't know what happened when the Erie County DA did their investigation, but the fact that witnesses described the men as being tall, all of them were described as being tall, none of them were described as being short. And the things that the eyewitnesses says, based on what was released to the public, I'm not sure when the DA mentioned that the deceased was engaged in an altercation. I'm not sure if you mean the deceased was attacked, or I'm not sure if you were saying the deceased was actively involved in the altercation. What was your take
well,
on
in
that,
fact,
Mr. Williamson?
I can clarify that the press conference that she was talking about happened after the close of the grand jury. They returned what we call in the criminal law a no bill. That means no indictment, meaning that they found grounds that would lend itself to not bringing criminal charges against the person responsible for this person's death. So one thing that the public should know is that although we don't have a name, and even if we did, we likely couldn't give it right now, it's known who this person is. This is not a case of, missed identity. So what the DA said is not only that Tyler was involved in an altercation, but that he was the main player in the altercation. This
Okay,
fight was
so,
supposed to have,
so you see
right.
that is a problem, because if you're saying it was disclosed to the public that he was actively involved in the altercation, that may be a statement that should be reviewed based in light of what is said in the autopsy report, based on what the witnesses said, based on all the circumstances. I think that statement needs to be reviewed, because if perchance, and I think the family is in the process of getting an expert to examine the autopsy report and give a detailed report of what they believe were the circumstances surrounding this young man's life. As
Right.
people know, as the public know, every body tells a story. When I say body, I mean any dead body tells a story. And
Right.
any medical examiner could examine a body in detail and be able to tell you, like, what was this person doing immediately before they died? Was this person involved in the altercation immediately before they died? And based on what we are learning, people are saying the people who are actually involved in the altercation fled the scene, they ran.
Yes.
And the question is, could this deceased run from the scene with an active stab wound to the heart? This went straight to his heart. So there was no consideration. There's no time to think. There's no time for anything else. So if you know that the victim was stabbed directly to the heart immediately after the altercation, what would be your thoughts on that, Mr. Williamson?
Well, without being a doctor and without knowing anything about people getting stabbed to the heart, common sense would tell me that it would likely be impossible for anybody to be able to move or to be functional or to run anywhere after they're stabbed to the heart, even if it's a single stab wound, you know? So the next step is, once you have that curiosity, you would ask an expert. If you don't know it, you would ask an expert whether or not it's
Right,
possible.
right. And the other question is, if he was indeed involved in the altercation, like the DA is claiming, and they're claiming, if I'm wrong, please correct me, that he was in a car. So if he was in a car, the question is, was there blood found in the car that matches that of the deceased?
Well, according to the DA, there was actually blood inside of the car. But if I'm not mistaken, and we can review it again because I don't want to misquote anybody, but I believe he said that the blood that was found in the car was the blood of the assailant. And the blood, of course, would have been drawn when he was getting allegedly beat up by the other gentlemen that were with Mr. Lewis that night.
Right. So that creates an issue by itself, because if we were told that the deceased was sitting in the car at the time of the stab, the question is, why isn't his blood in the car? It was a fatal stab wound. So to the public, this went straight to his heart. And like I said, the stab was in an angle, which gives the impression that the assailant was over on the left side, because the stab wound went from right to left down in an angle. It's about 5 centimeters in length. So that kind of like gives you a clue as to what was happening. But the question is, if the deceased was stabbed in the car, where is the blood in the car that corroborates the story?
Well,
Where
that's
is the
another one,
blood?
right? Exactly. So look, um, if in fact there was blood from the would-be assailant, once again, we don't have this gentleman's name, but he was the subject of a grand jury. If there was blood of the would-be assailant and everything, then the likely place that would have come from would have been, if he was getting stomped out and beat up by a bunch of people apparently trying to rob him. The explanation that was given as to why none of Tyler Lewis's blood was in the car was because this happened in October of 2022. And it was said that he had on thick layers of clothing and therefore he wasn't able to bleed through it. So once again, you mentioned that a stab wound came from the heart. Is that the case? Because every claim that somebody makes, you want to analyze it to find out whether or not it's true. So claim from the DA's office, he was stabbed. None of his blood was in the car. Mind you, he said that he was stabbed in the car and that none of his blood was in the car because he had on layers. Okay, well, is that the case? Can we challenge that? Would there have been blood in the car, whether he had layers on or not? How thick were the layers,
The other issue would be the knife that was used would have had blood. So where did the blood on the knife went? So I think there's a lot of questions that the family still they have questions. Everybody should have questions if they review the facts surrounding this case. This case is still a mystery, by the way, and we're trying to solve it. So if anybody listening to this program have any information regarding this, I would appreciate if they would call our office, call my office at 718-877-3100, and let me know if you were there and you saw exactly what happened on that day. It was October 14 of 2022. It happened at the Buffalo University at Buffalo campus. So if people have any information relating to this, they need to call and let us know. Because as far as we know, all of the statement given to the police, there's no evidence, no indication that the facts as presented by the Erie County DA is correct. So we don't have any evidence pointing to what he actually said. And even if my take is, if the victim is in the car, he's layered in clothes, how many layers could you wear when your blood, which pumps pretty fast, is pumping out blood faster than you could even think? Like, how much layer would it need to suck all of that blood in? Besides, a knife was used. The knife probably you would have seen some sort of droplets of blood in the car, possibly, but there is no evidence of any blood. Possibly, where's the DNA evidence of the victim that was in the car? I don't see anything on the record or from the evidence that was provided through the FOIA request that tells me they put the victim in the car, or the victim was placed in the car at the time of death or at the time he was stabbed. Rather, the point at where they found the victim in the parking lot seems more logical to me, that that's where he was killed. Because once you're stabbed in the heart, the thing is, most people are going to think a person who's fatally stabbed in the heart wouldn't have time to react or run. Chances are you're going to start bleeding so profusely and so quickly that you're likely to faint very quick, very early in the process, versus having the opportunity to react, to run any distance, as claimed by the Erie County DA. I think this needs to be investigated further. I believe more people need to come forward with information. And then we go to the civil claim. We still have a civil claim pending in the New York Court of Claims against the state of New York for the
Right.
wrongful death of Tyler Lewis. I'm the attorney on that case, and that case is still pending. And there's two developments which I wanted to bring to the public's attention. First of all, the claim was filed. It was filed about October, November, in January of 2023. So that's just a few months after the incident it was filed. And then the family discovered new information. New information came to light during the time, because this case, it's a mystery, and the way it was handled, we think it could have been handled very, very differently if the victim was of another race. We think there might be a racial element involved that might be very subtle, and you have to look very carefully because it's there. Because just thinking about the way it was handled, no one was actually charged. It just went before a grand jury and then it was just tossed out. Nobody was indicted for the murder of Tyler Lewis. And just all the public is writing on is what the Erie County DA had to say about the circumstances. But we would like the public to know that this case is highly questionable, and that not to take the Erie County's DA's word for it, but to be more inquisitive and ask more questions and look into the evidence that we have for yourself and make your own determination. Of course, we're going to have an expert review the autopsy, not just leave it based on what we saw from what the medical examiner wrote in his report, which I mentioned to you. He described the stab wound, and he described as one area of the body having contusion. And this is a person that, what we were told, was actively, as you heard Mr. Williamson said, that the Erie County DA said that Tyler Lewis was an active participant of that altercation. Yet there is no other hyperpigmentation on the body. There's no other area on the body described by the medical examiner as having any form of impact, any other contusion, any type of evidence to show that he was actively punching or being punched or anything of the sort. All that is present is one impact wound, the stab wound to the heart, fatal, that took his life prematurely. That's all that we have, and that's all that we're working on based on the medical examiner's report. And it contradicts to some extent what the Erie County DA wants the public to believe. And we're asking the public, call the Erie County DA and ask them to reopen the case and to reinvestigate, because this is not complete. This is an incomplete file that they rushed to judgment and close the file and label it as justifiable homicide. The family doesn't think it's justifiable homicide. We don't believe it's justifiable homicide, and we believe that more work needs to be done. As it relates to the civil case that is still pending before the New York Court of Claims, there's two claims. We filed the first claim, and a second claim was filed in which the state failed to respond. So we have a default against the state on the second claim. But we're going to see what happens with the second claim. The state claimed that they had defenses, but it was never filed. So now they're asking the family to file a stipulation to allow them to merge the claims. And we're saying no, because they were saying the second claim was late, and we don't want any confusion because they've already defaulted on the second claim. So the question is, or the issue is, whether or not the Tyler Lewis family are going to be able to get that default judgment against the state of New York. The Attorney General's office has defaulted on the second claim, like I said.
Right.
Mr. Williamson, the time has already gone on us, so I'm going to take your closing remarks quickly, And then, we're going to end the show for today. So your closing remarks, please.
Yeah, definitely. Well, first off, I'd like to send a, thank you to Miss Lewis for joining the podcast. She's been really brave and strong throughout this entire process after having lost her only son to violence. She is still looking for justice, and I just want to reiterate what Ms. Washington said earlier. For anybody watching that might have any suggestions, thoughts, leads on anything in this case, because once again, there are a lot of aspects of this case that are mysterious to us. She gave you the number. Please give that number a call. We're in close contact, and I'll definitely act off of whatever useful information anybody can provide. And I'd like to thank everybody who tuned in today for listening and taking the time to understand.
Thank you so much, Mr. Williamson, for your
Thanks
time
for having
today
me.
and
Always.
your input in this case. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today for another edition of The Law and You. It was a pleasure bringing you this edition. If anyone is within the hearing of my voice, if you're looking at the show and you're in need of legal representation, please give us a call. The phone number to call is 718-877-3100. Again, the phone number to reach our office at is 718-877-3100. Thank you guys so much. I encourage you to like the post, share this live, share it as much as you can. And don't be afraid to press that like button. We appreciate the support. Thank you so much, guys.